I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. When Jeff VanderMeer's Southern Reach trilogy was first published 10 years ago, it was an instant sensation. There were 3 best-selling books: Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance. Awards were won, a movie was made, and Jeff built a massive fan base, which included literary icons Stephen King and N.K. Jemisin. The series centers on a place called Area X. Area X is a mysterious environmental phenomenon where fantastical and kind of horrifying creatures are lurking, and a lot of really weird, unexplainable stuff is happening. Most of the humans who venture to Area X don't come back, and those who do return come back changed. Earlier this year, Jeff announced that the Southern Reach saga wasn't over. His new book, a 4th installment called Absolution, reveals the prehistory of Area X and extends the story of Area X into the future. Jeff VanderMeer joined me from his home in Tallahassee, Florida. Hi, Jeff. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So your fiction, not just the Southern Reach saga, but also your other work, transports us into these strange, imaginative worlds that often push the boundaries of space and time, and they highlight some tensions between humans and nature, cause us to question even what is nature and what the boundary between humans and nature is. What attracts you to writing about these sort of strange places that are of this world, but also of another world?
I think because it's maybe a truer version of reality in the sense that there's this permeability between our bodies and our environment that's invisible but ongoing, that we're kind of like only in the last couple of decades really focused on. And that's, not only relevant to like personal health, but also just to like seeing the world more clearly. And I think when you're out hiking, like I am in Florida or even on the West Coast, like I also like to do, you get into these kind of reveries or these moments where the world seems to open up in ways that are both beautiful, a little strange, a little disorienting. And sometimes you're even a little lost because you're actually in places so remote that you don't have Wi-Fi and you may not be exactly sure where you are. And I think those are the moments where narrative lives, where you kind of like fill in the gaps with the fiction to some degree.
Mm. What you're talking about is reminding me of like when I first started reading Gothic fiction and was first being taught it in high school English and learning about kind of the sublime and humans going into nature and having these moments of being lost in it. And, that's obviously a sort of a genre of literature that's been around for a while. Your work is associated with something newer, this sort of idea of the new weird. I mean, they put new in the title. And it's this idea of a genre that merges some elements of sci-fi, of fantasy, of that maybe older horror, even Gothic horror. And in doing so, creates something that's like a little bit even more uncanny than any of those things. And its predecessors include, nature writers like Thoreau, but also people like Lovecraft, people like Kafka. Arguably, you could even go all the way back to stuff like Wuthering Heights or like a Frankenstein type novel. When did your interest in like this weird fiction begin?
I don't know that I really had an interest in weird fiction so much as I had an interest in the ways in which the biology of the non-human in our world are often very strange, but also very wondrous, So even looking at the life cycle of a squid or mushrooms, which are kind of like between plants and animals in their physiognomy, so to speak, is wondrous. It's kind of like you realize you're living on an alien planet. There's just an amazing complexity of life here. So it's kind of more through the biology and the fact that at one point I actually wanted to be a marine biologist. I just gravitated more towards narrative. So, for example, I started out as a birder as a kid, but then eventually those became stories about birds instead of lists of birds. So.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about the weirdness of the natural world and the fact that I think like as we learn more about the natural world, there are like species that have been discovered in, say, the past 100 years as our technology and ability to research, say, the depths of the ocean has increased that we would have thought were totally alien and impossible before we actually found them. Like that's what that draws to mind for me of, yeah, squid are weird. Anglerfish are weird. If you'd never seen one before, you might think it was an alien.
Yeah, and I think that really it speaks to something about the kind of fiction I want to write, which is to talk about or experience or encounter a thing that may be very beautiful, that may actually be benign, but because it's unknown, our first thought is to have an adverse reaction to it, or perhaps to not really see it for what it is. And so a lot of what I'm doing is like re-examining the world around us. And maybe it's in an uncanny context, but it's really about reflections of the real world and trying to get to some truth about the way in which we exist in that world alongside our fellow beings.
I'm so glad you brought up this idea of when we encounter things that are unfamiliar, even if they are natural, there's this idea that it must inherently be threatening or must inherently be dangerous. And it's like this thing that needs to be neutralized. Because I think that that's sort of the vibe that I get from Area X in your novels, that it's this thing that's being researched and encountered and is perceived as something that could only be bad because it's this phenomenon that doesn't seem natural, even though like maybe it is just a part of the natural world. You know, it's been 10 years since you first introduced readers to this creepy, kind of captivating, enchanting place known as Area X. What is Area X? What is so uncanny about it?
Well, I think, you know, some of the uncanniness comes from the invisibility. And of course, in the movie, they added something called the shimmer that's actually visible because it's hard to do a movie with an invisible border. What happens is that on this kind of desolate, still populated, but remote part of, you know, it's never named, but Florida coast, you know, it's the forgotten coast, actually, an area I know quite well. This invisible border has come down and something is going on, you know, beyond that border on the coastline. And so in the books, the secret agency, the Southern Reach, is tasked with finding out what's happening, especially because there's evidence that the border is expanding and they don't know what the inciting incident was. And of course, the confusing thing is that when some of the expeditions go in, not only do they not find anything unnatural, they just find that Area X is kind of getting rid of the pollutants that have been caused by human-built structures. And so there is this kind of conundrum in there where it's like both threatening, but it's also doing something that on some level is seen as benign. At the same time, other expeditions find completely uncanny, bizarre circumstances going on inside that border. So it's kind of like they're investigating a life form or a thing where they don't understand the seasons of it or the rhythm of it. And I think that's actually a little bit like how we sometimes live within the world ourselves. We see pieces of what the rhythms of the world are, but we're continually cut off from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many things that happen in Area X that are just sort of like, if you or I were to encounter something like that, would be totally baffling. There's this time dilation that happens where things seem to decay or rot much faster than they would in our world. There's creatures that appear there that are unlike creatures that exist outside of this area. No one really knows in these books what exactly caused the creation of Area X, and some of the mystery of it is that these characters that are researching it are trying to figure out exactly what the root of these phenomena is, especially in the second book where it's really focusing on people that are, you know, running these expeditions into Area X. Can you share what are some of the ideas that are discussed? Because it's a lot of ideas that to me kind of straddle the boundary of like it's natural, but in a way that humans can't quite understand or grasp yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think really there's a thing going on here about the unknowability of the universe, which is to say we'll never get all the answers that we want about the universe at large anyway, and our understanding of the universe keeps changing. In fact, physics changed so much while I was writing these books that at a certain point I was gleeful because the time dilations, other things that you're talking about, you know, were kind of speculative in nature. But then when I was reading some of the current advanced physics stuff, it was like, it's much more bizarre than anything I could come up with. And so I guess that's part of it. And then part of it is how our human institutions, and this does, I think, touch on climate crisis to some degree, are not up to the task of dealing with the reality of the world as it is. And so I found there was a great deal of friction, tension, and narrative suspense in the Southern Reach having all these protocols, all these things that should work that keep failing with Area X because again, they don't quite understand it. They're bringing all these foundational things in that don't quite work in the new paradigm. And this was very much what I encountered when I worked as a contractor engaging with government agencies in the U.S., that there was a certain intractable element of the past that overshadowed the operations of the future, so to speak. And I find that disconnect and the stories that kind of live in that illogic extremely illuminating about how we deal with, problems and general issues of all kinds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the part about the sort of dysfunction of this government bureaucracy and its inability to respond to these events that kind of can't be compressed neatly into like paperwork and government procedures, or even like the ability to record what's going on. Like they've stopped sending cameras into Area X because the footage they get back is just like totally useless to them. And they've rolled everything back to like the technology that would have been being used in the 50s or whatever. Everything's like you got to bring in a paper journal and write down on paper your observations. I'm curious to know like what your experience was working as a subcontractor, and like maybe you can talk about it, maybe not.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Like I did once go into a job situation and inherit a desk that had a dead mouse and a plant in one of the drawers, as happens in authority to the new director of the Southern Reach. I did have a guy on the first day at that same job peer his head in and say, "Would you like to see a strange room?" as happens to the director in authority a little later. And of course, my answer then was no, not on the first day, maybe the last day on the job, I'd go to see a strange room. So there are all these absurdities. And then like having a meeting where like $1 million in monies would be spent. And they were spent in a different way because the guy in charge had not gotten his coffee that morning and was in a bad mood. So you begin to see a lot of irregularities in human thought. But there is also a way in which, these things mirror the modern condition. And so I think there's things about even the technology you're talking about that are about like the fact that now we have smart refrigerators that can kind of read what our wants and needs are ad-wise or surveil on us. And so the idea with regard to Area X and the technology was the more primitive the technology, the less Area X can hack it. Mm-hmm. And the more advanced, because it's still primitive compared to Area X, the easier it is for them to then kind of like, listen in and use that technology to subvert the expeditions. And so I thought that was an interesting mode to be in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm such like an anti-smart fridge person. I always say like I want everything in my house to be dumb. Like I actually don't want my fridge to be able to listen to me and tell me what food I want to eat. I want to ask, it's been 10 years since you wrote the Southern Reach trilogy. Of course, it's not a trilogy anymore because there's now this fourth book. Why did you choose this moment to return to this world?
I didn't really have a choice. I had the idea for this novel in 2017, and I have this habit these days of thinking for a very long time about a novel before I write it. And so I thought very much about this exciting idea of this expedition of biologists to the Forgotten Coast 20 years before Area X forms, and how central this secret agency in the books, how its involvement and subversion of that expedition actually exacerbates and makes Area X worse when it appears, and what that would mean in terms of the layered history of that entire coast. And then when I got the idea for, these sections that are set 18 months before Area X comes down and then after Area X comes down, and to show the actual first expedition and just how kind of deranged everything got. And I just thought about it for several years. And then July 31st of last year, I had what amounts to an ecstatic vision, and I started writing, and I did not stop until December 31st. And when I kind of like raised my eyes from the page, I had a final draft of 150,000 words, novel, some parts of which I didn't remember writing. Now, obviously there's a lot of conscious revision and editing, but it was a really amazing and exhausting experience. I was writing morning, noon, and night. I was driven to write it.
Mm. You mentioned a little bit in that answer the sort of timeline of this fourth novel and the fact that much of it takes place prior to this border coming down between Area X and the rest of the world. there's this period that's 20 years before, there's this period that's 18 months before, when things are sort of starting to get really serious and there's a lot of strange happenings. And then there's this part of the book that follows the first expedition that the Southern Reach sends into Area X after the border comes down, which is something that had been kind of mythical in the trilogy. It gets talked about a lot, but we don't really know that much about what happened. Why did you want to dive back into these points in time in the sort of story of Area X? Because I read the trilogy first, then read this fourth book. It wasn't totally where I would have expected to dive back into the story.
I think these books are always going to be a little unexpected. With Authority, readers didn't really expect that I would dive into an expedition into the bureaucracy of the Southern Reach. I think they expected another expedition into Area X. Here, I was really driven by the character of Old Jim, because when I wrote what some fans will remember as the infamous piano scene in the village bar, where Area X kind of infiltrates his mind, I didn't know I was going to write that. And it's seen as one of the more terrifying scenes in the trilogy to a lot of readers, where he's sitting at this piano and things go extremely wrong. So I was kind of like taken by that image. And I was taken also by all of the things about the Seance and Science Brigade, this kind of bunch of amateur and uncanny sleuths, what they were doing on the Forgotten Coast, how they were involved with Area X. And it wasn't something that could be really explored in the character viewpoints of the first three books, but I thought it was kind of important and interesting. But then also this layering of history, because often what happens in the real world is we never reconcile the things that happened in the past. And because we don't come to terms with them, even worse things happen in the present. And so I wanted to explore that. And I wanted to explore themes of forgiveness and reconciliation and also abandonment. There's a big, strong theme of abandonment here. And I think that this also speaks to how I try to take something topical, like say the topic of ghosting, and I try to get to the core of what it's about and then insert it in these novels in such a way where it feels organic, but it's also about the wider theme, which is say abandonment is the wider theme of ghosting or fear of abandonment.
Yeah, there's so much there. I mean, abandonment in terms of the abandonment of an area that's experienced some kind of ecological change or disaster. There's personal abandonment within a family. One thread I want to pick up on, you mentioned this Seance and Science Brigade, which is like one of my favorite parts of these works. It's just like such a fun name of a group of people, and they have this kind of real quirky affect about them. Yeah. For folks that maybe need a refresher, haven't read the novels, what's the Seance and Science Brigade?
They literally are this kind of troupe of amateur psychic investigators who get kind of infiltrated by Central. And so Central kind of repurposes them to be more focused on the things that Central, like a CIA-like organization, is interested in. And I got the idea in a really interesting way. And it's kind of like what was in my head when I was writing Absolution, which is to say there's this place called the Coral Castle in Miami, built by this eccentric Lithuanian. And it has all of these amazing fortifications and weird sculptures that line up with the equinox and the moon and the sun. And the day that I went there was a team of psychics investigating the effects and a team of scientists. And they were like they were on two separate sides of this structure doing entirely different things. And I was just fascinated that this one place could pull both groups who are pretty much diametrically opposed in their view of the world into this. And so the idea and the name came from that. And I had the idea that their intervention and Central's intervention with them was pretty key to a lot of the things that happened with Area X.
That's a fantastic background story. I'm like, a sentence I've never said. Now I want to go to Florida and see the Coral Castle. I'm like, this is Disney World. Who cares? I want to go see this and meet the psychics. Yeah. Area X is certainly dangerous, but it's also very lush and vivid, and there's some descriptions of it that are quite beautiful. And you mentioned earlier in our conversation, it's not explicitly set in Florida, but it's very much, it is Florida. There's marshes, there's swamplands, there's beach, there's ocean, there's this forgotten coast. And you live in northern Florida and obviously are very familiar with the environment there. Can you talk a little bit about the setting and your inspiration for it?
Yeah, I think that it was really a major role in this being the setting is that the first time in 1992 or 93 that I hiked the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, which is on the Forgotten Coast, I did the 14-mile trail, and I didn't realize a thunderstorm was going to come up. And I got completely lost, and I lost my map, and I didn't know where I was. And even though it turned out that I was only literally like a mile from the road, there was a long period where I thought I was literally lost on the coast, and I was going to have to find my way to the sea to track back. Mm. And again, this idea of narrative living in the places that you don't know, I think that that's where Area X came about. And then also the Gulf oil spill, which threatened the refuge at one point, kind of means that I think to some degree my subconscious made Area X as kind of a protective, gesture towards that area. But it's incredibly biodiverse. It's like the 7th most biodiverse place in the United States and ranks nationally and is so little known. Mm-hmm. And there are so many micro ecosystems along that trail. It is absolutely stunning and unlike anything else that you'll ever see, and extremely prehistoric. And the way the light hits is absolutely stunning some of the mornings through the clouds. Like it'll literally be a halo of light that looks unnatural, but absolutely gorgeous.
Mm. There's some other settings that, at least from, reading a bit about your biography and reading also the acknowledgments to the third book, there are other places that seem to have inspired in some ways your work. In the acknowledgments to acceptance, you mentioned 2 locations on Vancouver Island, and there's a part in the trilogy where characters do travel to this unnamed place on the West Coast. I also know that you spent some of your childhood growing up in the Fiji Islands in the South Pacific, which is also like a super ecologically rich region. What impacts have some of these other locations had on your relationship with the natural world and perhaps on your writing?
I think they all have a density of life that's absolutely amazing. And the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, the area near Portland, where I often visit a friend of mine, is just stunning. It's just, again, has that fecundity that I really respond to. And I think that's really also because of growing up in Fiji, which was a tropical paradise. Nature was right there at your doorstep all the time. And so, I come out of this tradition of having had a wealth of biodiversity around me in a way that I think a lot of writers have. And so it's very natural for me to put it in the books, although I have to be careful because it has to come through character point of view. So, the biologist obviously is a lot more invested in that than some of the other characters in the other novels.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn to current events, so to speak. And I think the relationship that we've sort of talked a little bit about between the content of the Southern Reach novels and things that are going on in the world that we have to contend with as humans in terms of like ecological disaster and transformation. We're speaking in early October, and I understand that you just actually had to evacuate your home in Florida because of Hurricane Helene. And now Hurricane Milton, as we're talking, is this new threat. People are going to have to evacuate, in some cases, for the second time in 2 weeks. How do you see this series and your work engaging with some of the questions and challenges that we're facing today as a result of the climate crisis and other forms of ecological and environmental disaster, what have you?
Well, I do think that we often feel frozen or have the wrong solutions to climate crisis. Here in Florida, we often see hard cement walls put up, or in one case, sand put on beaches in Tampa to restore a beach that then just a few weeks later was wiped off that beach. Again, I'm not laughing about the human cost, but I am laughing about the absurdity of the solution. So we replace sand, it goes away. We replace it again. We spend all this money on these things that are absurd, that make no sense. We continue to build in places that we shouldn't build in because we literally need the natural defenses of like barrier islands to do the things we're supposed to do. So I think in that way, it definitely mirrors Area X in how the Southern Reach tries to grapple with something that, also admittedly is so large that it's very difficult to grasp the entirety of and to create policy that makes sense for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, everything that you're talking about, like all of these are things that the part of the world where I grew up in Nova Scotia also we're dealing with, right? We also get significant hurricanes. Yeah. Usually they've become less powerful by the time they make their way up there. But, yeah, there is this absurdity and futility almost sometimes with the measures that people are willing to adopt in response. And these questions about like, can people continue living in areas where they've always lived or have historically built community is definitely something that we're thinking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the storms have also gotten larger and more rapid in their movements and gotten stronger faster because of climate change and warmer waters, to the point when I finally put a hurricane in a book, which in this case is Absolution, the new one. It's almost an uncanny event for the biologists in it because it feels that way to me. It feels like, again, this inescapable thing that at one point we felt like we could understand, we could have a rational escape route for. But now even, where I escaped to, Greenville, South Carolina, was not necessarily the best spot. But then what spot is when storms are more unpredictable and they affect the inland, a lot more than they used to.
Mm-hmm. You just wrote this essay for the New York Times about this escape and about this unpredictability of storms and how it makes it so much more difficult to make a plan to evacuate or how to protect your home and all of these things. And in the essay, you suggest that you're rethinking your future in Florida and having some complicated feelings about that. Can you speak a bit more about how you're thinking about that?
It's fatiguing. It's extremely mentally fatiguing. People, I don't think, realize who don't live in extreme weather zones that are getting worse can realize because it's an economic cost to have to keep evacuating. And then there's the fact that because of where we've built, evacuation can be hard for some people. So imagine being in Key West and a hurricane comes up and you have to travel hundreds of miles on a 2-lane or 3-lane road or whatever, just to get to Miami, which is probably at that point extremely traffic bound as well. So it becomes more and more of an issue of economics, and of course, disadvantaged people are much worse off. Some people cannot even move and there's not enough support for that. So I am rethinking it. I am spending more time on the West Coast in Portland. And, there is a mental health issue. It is much more fatiguing than people realize. And when that piece came out, I was trepidatious about the response. I wanted to make sure I'd been correct about the psychological impact and respectful. And there was such an outpouring of people saying, this is exactly how I feel. It's not as clear cut as leaving or staying. It's even like, where do I go to? Where can I actually be safe? What do I take with me? It's tough.
Ultimately, the humans in your story are sort of really small in the face of their environment. One of the central characters, the biologist, is almost gratified that nature is winning. It's sort of like she's spent so much time engaging with nature and really has this respect and reverence for it. And this brings to mind for me this line from Kafka where he says, "There's infinite hope, only not for us." And so I'm curious, like when it comes to our own struggles in our world with the environment, do you find yourself hopeful at all? Is there any shade of optimism to your engagement with these questions we're talking about?
Well, I mean, I think if you put it in terms of what's in the novel, so for example, in Absolution, I think that the hopefulness is in the struggle despite the odds, so to speak, and trying to come to kind of a clear understanding and also adaptation. I mean, Absolution is a prequel, but also a sequel in a sense. And so it gives you a glimpse of what that adaptation might look like. And so I do think we have to change pretty radically, how we think about the world. But I do think it is possible. And I think that it is still something that we can do. But we have to see the world a little more clearly than we currently do. We have to have policies that make sense and are not politicized.
It makes me think of there's that, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but there's the Ursula Le Guin quote where she's talking about specifically capitalism, but just the broader relevance is this idea of like these changes that we can't even imagine making to our society. And she's talking about, capitalism feels inevitable because we're living in it, but so did the divine right of kings when that was something that we all lived with. And I think that some of what you're discussing in terms of the way that we grapple with the environment, the way we respond to ecological disaster, it's like we lack imagination maybe in some cases of how we can respond. And I think one thing that you've talked about as well is the idea of like small actions that are within our control where we're not going to change the world, but we can change perhaps our backyard, as in literally you've been rewilding your backyard in Tallahassee. I'm wondering, can you chat a little bit more about what that entails and what drew you to that project?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, what you talk about with regard to imagination is so important, and it's something that drives how I see my characters. It's like, do they have a generous imagination? Do they have a way of engaging with the world that allows them to see it more clearly? Are they still trying to do something, even if they're compromised by systems? And this speaks to your question, because I think we get frozen by the immensity of the systems that we're enclosed in that take away our agency. And so we don't know how to operate on a problem that's like national or international. And so, when I started planting native plants and catering more to the birds and the wildlife in my yard, it was kind of a way of living in the moment, of finding something that would allow me to unfreeze on the higher, wider level. And so I think when you spend a little portion of your day, if you can, doing something that has a concrete benefit to, say, a bird that is only going to live 6 years, because that's its lifespan, and maybe in your yard it doesn't know anything about climate crisis for those 6 years. You provided a moment for it. And so I think that's really what I'm talking about with the rewilding, is it doesn't have to be that. It's just something on a small scale that gives you some pleasure, but you also know is helping in some concrete way. And then I think it's possible with that anchor to engage with the wider issues.
Jeff, thank you again so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
You just heard my conversation with Jeff VanderMeer about his best-selling Southern Reach series. This episode was produced by Katie Swales. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. There's a big team behind Bookends, and it includes our amazing radio techs and the wider CBC Books team. I want to thank them for the work they do to make this show happen every week. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio, or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.